Hey, what's going on everyone? Tyler here. Today I'm going to be talking about the A7S III and the R5. Now I've owned both of these cameras. I purchased them like probably a little under a year ago. And in that time I've used them on a number of different projects. So I feel like I've kind of gotten to get to know both of these cameras pretty well over the course of the year. Mostly focused on video in this video, but we'll touch on photo a little bit at the end. But I figured I'd make a comparison video kind of talking about these cameras, and mostly based on like user experience actually out in the field. So not really like test charty or anything like that. But I think it's an interesting time to compare these cameras because when they were first announced, the A7S III was way better, miles ahead of the R5 with regards to video capabilities. Namely because, first of all, it had more dynamic range with the SLog 3, whereas you only had Canon LUT 1 on the R5. And like all the headline features of the R5 were basically not even usable because of the overheating issues. But since then, Canon has done some kind of non-Canon things and have like updated the firmware to kind of improve the R5, and it kind of makes it a little bit more comparable to the A7S and kind of closes that gap. They gave us Canon LUT 3 in the cinema gamut, which pretty awesome, and then they just recently updated the firmware to, for all intents and purposes, gets rid of the overheating. You can basically set the auto power temperature setting, whatever, to high, kind of like you can do on the Sony, and you never have overheating pop up for the most part. You can get both the cameras still to overheat if you really want to, but it's just really hard to do that now with both of these cameras. So that said, I figured it'd be kind of interesting to kind of compare these cameras. Like I said, not super scientific, more so just kind of based on user experience and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and jump into it and start with dynamic range. So with dynamic range, the A7S III definitely wins in this category, but I definitely wouldn't say it wins by a landslide. The R5 and Canon LUT 3 is definitely no slouch when it comes to dynamic range, and when you apply a grade for like a Rec 709 export especially, the differences become much more negligible, and then there's just some like nuances between the cameras that we'll talk about. So for example, right here, this shot right here, this is a pretty challenging scene for any camera. You got dark shadows, bright highlights, you know, filming through a window, all that kind of stuff. And it's just a really challenging scene. And honestly, the cameras look almost identical when it comes to dynamic range, and I posted this on my community page to kind of see like what other people thought, to see if maybe make sure I wasn't going crazy. But nobody said anything about dynamic range in these images, and people mentioned that one was warmer, or you know, one looked a little different, but it was more personal preference. It wasn't super night and day between dynamic range, and that's a good thing. That just means both of the cameras perform really well when it comes to dynamic range. Now, one area where the A7S III really shines is when it comes to highlight roll-off, and this is really important to just get a more natural looking image, especially out in like bright sunlight and stuff. So for example, take a look at this shot right here. You can see on the A7S III, on my arm, when I pause it, you can see, hopefully YouTube compression doesn't mess this up, but the roll-off on my arm just looks really nice and natural and pleasing, and like almost like filmic. Like it's really impressive. Whereas on the R5, it's definitely a little bit more of a harsher roll-off, and kind of makes it look a little bit more video-y. And this is when you're just comparing the two cameras side by side. Again, I think the R5 is really good. I think it performs really well, but the A7S III definitely outperforms it in dynamic range, especially in the highlight roll-off category. All right, next up is low light, and A7S III definitely wins in this department, no doubt, especially when you go up to 12,800 ISO and above. But that said, if you're kind of in like the mid-range ISOs these days, like at between like 1600 and 6400, the R5 honestly I think looks better than the A7S III, just from a noise perspective. The R5's noise is definitely much more manageable than the A7S III's, so you know, take that for what it's worth. Next up is autofocus, and I'm going to give the nod to the R5 here simply because in video mode you have more autofocus features like animal eye autofocus and like car detection autofocus and like helmet detection and stuff. So you just have a more versatile autofocusing system and a smarter autofocusing system than the A7S III. But when it comes to stuff like like talking head stuff or, you know, following people around or anything like that, like documentary style stuff and people, either cameras, it's kind of a wash. Like they're both just as good as each other, and you know, they seem to both struggle in the same like backlit areas kind of stuff, but honestly they're kind of a wash at that point. But with the other additional like smarter features in the R5, definitely going to give it to the R5 for autofocus. As for battery life, the A7S III definitely wins in the battery life department. It's pretty impressive how long the battery lasts on the A7S III. The R5 isn't bad. It's not as bad as like the R5C or like the Blackmagic Pocket 6K or anything like that, but it is definitely worse than the A7S III. So, you know, super handy like for an entire shoot day where I'm like cameras on all day, I'm rolling all day. I can get through with like 6 batteries or so on the A7S III, whereas I'd probably want like, you know, between 8 and 10 batteries on the R5 to kind of get me through the same scenario. So battery life definitely wins for the A7S III. Next up is rolling shutter, and the A7S III wins in this category, and it is very impressive how well it handles rolling shutter. That said, like the R5 is really impressive and has really impressive rolling shutter performance, considering the fact that it has an 8K full frame sensor as opposed to a 4K full frame sensor. So the R5 doesn't have terrible rolling shutter performance, just the A7S III has some of the best rolling shutter performance I've ever seen on a full frame camera. All right, now for image quality and detail, this one is kind of interesting, and they kind of are winners in their own right. So up to 30p, 30 frames per second, the R5 wins with the detail hands down, because number one, it can record in 8K resolution, both in RAW and in compressed, and you can also record in the 4K HQ mode, which is basically downsampled from that 8K resolution. And that is just a super detailed image and it just looks beautiful. But as soon as you get into higher frame rates, anything above 30p, you enter in this like the line skip mode, so the image gets noticeably softer than the 4K HQ mode. Whereas on the A7S III, although it's not as detailed as 4K HQ on the R5, it doesn't go into any line skip mode, so there's consistent quality among all frame rates. So if that's really important to you, I think the A7S III might be the winner for you in that category. But if you film mostly in like 24p for the most part, then I think you're gonna find that the detail in the R5 is definitely more detailed than the A7S III. And then with IBIS, instead of talking about it here, I figured it would just be more fun to go out to the woods and get on a trail and just kind of do like a vloggy style test. You can kind of see what's going on with the IBIS and these two different camera systems. Right now I'm on the A7S Mark III. I've got the Zeiss 16-35 f4. It's got optical stabilization on it, so it's kind of working in conjunction, so you can kind of see how this looks. So I'm just gonna kind of walk around with the A7S III and kind of give like a vloggy test or something like that, so you can kind of get an idea of how that looks. So walking around now, and now we're going to switch over to the R5 and you can kind of see how that looks. And this is the Canon R5. I've got the 16-35, the EF lens adapted, which has optical stabilization, which is really nice, so you can kind of get an idea of how the two of these look. And I'll just put them side by side so you can kind of get an idea of how they look. I'm not trying to stabilize any particular way, it's just kind of like a vloggy type test. So I don't know, maybe this will be useful to you. Since walking kind of introduces a whole lot of shake just from walking handheld, I'm going to do a little stationary thing. This is on the R5, so you can kind of see what this looks like stationary with the IBIS. I don't know if in the corners if you can see anything that's going on. I can't really tell on the monitor. So we got that here, and now I'm going to switch over to the A7S and kind of see what that looks like. And then here on the A7S III, kind of see what's going on. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of put them side by side so you can kind of get an idea of how both of them look with the IBIS and see how, I don't know, which one you like better. So I'll let you be the judge there. I think they both look good. Definitely don't use digital IS on either of the cameras because it's pretty much like a warp stabilizer in camera, and I'd rather just do that in post-production and have more control and flexibility over that. So that's that. With IBIS, like I said, I think they both look good, but I'll let you be the judge on which one you think looks better. Now that said, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I found that I really like about these cameras over the other, and we'll start with the A7S III, and basically like all the things that I just mentioned that the A7S III kind of pulls ahead is, you know, what I like over the R5. Obviously, more dynamic range, better highlight roll-off, all that kind of stuff. And like I said, like even though the dynamic range like can be pretty comparable in most situations, having that extra dynamic range for those extreme situations is just nice to have in the A7S III, which is something I prefer over the R5, especially when it comes to highlight roll-off. I also like the fact that there's no record limit on the A7S Mark III. That's huge for long-form content, for events, speeches, all that kind of stuff. It's really important to not have a record limit, and I don't know why the R5 has that still. Hopefully they'll update that via firmware, but as it stands now, the A7S III is definitely better in that category. And the last thing is like you can pretty much map like all these buttons to pretty much anything you want, which is awesome with the A7S. It just kind of makes it more of a personal camera. Like you can pretty much make this camera like your camera, which is really cool, and kind of fits your workflow, which is really cool. And next up, lastly, is the fact that it has full-size HDMI. It's just so much nicer to have full-size HDMI than the micro HDMI on the R5. That said, there are some things on the R5 that I like over the A7S III. And the first thing is the high megapixel count for the high resolution stills images. I just like the high megapixel count over the 12 megapixels on the Sony A7S III. Next thing is the fact that it shoots in 8K resolution. I don't use it all the time, but it's really cool for like wildlife stuff or landscapes or establishing shots or something like that, just to kind of have that extra detail in like for reframing or punching in, all that kind of stuff. It's just kind of cool to have that extra resolution. The next thing I really like is the fact that you can take time-lapse movies in camera, and it actually spits out an actually time-lapse video file. On the A7S III, it has a built-in intervalometer, so you can, you know, take stills, but you have to bring all those into an NLE. But sometimes I don't want to have to like do all those steps just to have a time lapse in a video. Sometimes I just need to have a quick time lapse for a transition or something, and that's where being able to do that in camera is really nice. And the fact that you get an 8K time lapse is pretty stellar. Next up, in photo mode, I really like the fact that you can record video while you're in photo mode, which is really cool. And basically what it does is it uses the custom 3 preset, all the settings you save to custom 3, uses those settings. So whenever you hit record, it'll kind of flip to that mode real quick to take video, and as soon as you hit stop recording, it'll flip back over to photo mode. Just a really cool feature to have that in there, so I really like that. And then the next thing I really like is the fact that it has this little curtain over the sensor, so when you turn the camera off, it just protects the sensor a little bit more from like dust and stuff. And you know, I've taken this on shoots and like, you know, in the desert in Moab, up in the mountains, really rocky, dusty environments, at the beach, sandy environments. And it just gives you a little extra peace of mind that the sensor is covered when you go to turn it off to swap lenses. So yeah, I really like that there. And then the other thing that I really like is the fact that it uses CF Express Type B card as opposed to the Type A. And the reason being is because the Type B cards are used on more camera systems than the Type A cards. So, you know, my CF Express Type B cards I could use on, you know, the R3 or the Fuji X-H2 if I ever were to rent that camera, or like the Red V Raptor or the C500 Mark II. So those are pretty much like the primary things about these different camera systems that I really like over each other. So that said, which camera do I think is better than the other? Honestly, I don't think one is better than the other. I think they're both better in their own right, and that's probably not the answer you're looking for. But if I were to kind of sum these cameras up, from a video perspective, if all you do is video, I think the Sony A7S III is a better tool solely for video. When I go out for projects and I'm doing like event coverage or anything like that, I'm gonna bring the A7S III just because I know I don't have to worry about a record limit or anything like that, and the battery life is a little bit better. However, I would say that the R5 is an overall better hybrid camera, and honestly, I think it's the best hybrid camera out there, especially for the money, because you get the high resolution stills, you can get internal time-lapse movie recording modes, you get that animal eye autofocus, which is really cool in video, and you get 8K resolution. Even the high frame rates, they look good even though they're line skipped. So I think the R5 is a better suited true hybrid camera, whereas the A7S III is just a better camera suited solely for video. So I hope you found that helpful or useful. I've never done a camera comparison video, so hopefully this was a good video. If not, I'll probably learn from my mistakes for the next camera comparison video, which I think I'm going to do on the Sony FX6 versus the Red Komodo. And this is kind of coming from the perspective of two different owner-operators. My friend Josh Bernales, he owns the Sony FX6, and I own the Red Komodo. So we're going to kind of compare the two cameras based on our experiences using the camera. So be on the lookout for that video. Could be out in 2 weeks or 6 months. It depends, because my wife is 9 months pregnant and she could pop any minute now, and she literally could be in labor right now while I'm filming this YouTube video. So I should probably wrap this up and make sure that she's not giving birth while I'm talking about cameras. So I hope you found this helpful or useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content like this and filmmaking related stuff and all that good stuff. Let me know down in the comments below what I missed between these two cameras that you think is a standout feature of these two cameras, or whatever, or just let me know how I did on this camera comparison video. Just be nice in the comments. If you're really mean, then I'll just delete your comment and block you, because nobody's got time for negativity in this world. There's already enough of that in this world. So thanks so much for watching. I love each and every one of you, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.